So hello everyone and welcome to another one of our lunchtime epic talks. Today's talk marks International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and this is particularly focused on hidden disabilities and conditions. So I'd like to welcome Ted Smith, our speaker, who is a Senior Human Resources and Organisational Development Consultant. Ted is also the author of many books, including the award-nominated Human Resources, A to Z, a practical field guide for people managers. Through conversations with volunteer interviewees, Ted has written a book which is going to be the subject of our talk today. In it, he highlights the wide range of hidden disabilities and conditions that exist in the workplace and suggests appropriate accommodations that organisations can make to help their employees play a full part in the work environment, which all should be supported to do so. All profits from the sale of this book and all the talks that Ted gives will go to support Macmillan Cancer. In today's talk, Ted will summarise his learnings about hidden disabilities from initial diagnosis through to finding ways to make the workplace a more inclusive place. It's going to be structured into 3 sections with opportunities to ask questions or offer further ideas between sections. So if you'd like to submit your questions in the chat box, we will be putting a prompt for questions relating to each section and then you can add them in there. So without further ado, I'd again like to welcome Ted and hand over to him.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Tanzin. I first of all just want to thank you all for joining in today and being part of this, but I also just want to check if there's anybody who is partially sighted. It's to say that Wally can send a set of slides through, but I'm going to be speaking to the slides. There's very little on the slides that's that I won't be talking to, so you won't miss very much if you can't actually read them easily. And the second thing to say is the closed captions can be quite fun at times because they can misrepresent what you're saying. I've tried to get the light adjustment right so that you can read my lips, but if anyone is struggling with reading my lips or need me to speak more slowly, can they just put a message in the chat box and I will attempt to change accordingly. So first things first, on the first slide please, Wally. The first proper job I had was as an HR trainee over at Wycombe District Council. So I had a fantastic opportunity to work for 3 months in each section of the team, work, study, all sorts of bits and pieces. And then from there I went to work for Nielsen, a market research company, 14 years at Glaxo with all sorts of different roles, several biotechs, and then the Medical Research Council, before finally working with the Wellcome Trust and moving on to be a consultant. I chose to be a consultant just before the pandemic took off, and it wasn't a great moment because it meant that very little work I could actually get done. So I switched to what can I do, and I chose to start writing books. The reason that I wrote my first book on HR was simply because I'd been a student of HR and I was really fed up with the fact that everything was very, very academic. So what I did was to look at writing a book that was just full of practical examples. Some of those examples included a person who was blind, another person who had autism in the workplace, and it was those chapters that developed lots and lots of interest.
Sorry, Ted. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt, but we're getting a rather lot of feedback. It may be possible to move either your mic or speaker a fraction, just in case we're picking it up from you, because I think everyone else has the mic turned off now.
Okay.
It's still there. Are
no,
we all still hearing hum?
So the hum in the background is that the highways department have just turned up to hoover up all the leaves in the street in front of me.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
Hertfordshire Council are playing their part. Okay. And it is, I think, Hertfordshire rather than the district council for some reason. There's all sorts of interesting things I used to learn when I was at Wycombe about that. What happened in terms of this human resources book was that all the interest was generated about the hidden disabilities, and it became obvious that people were interested in that, and for me to develop that whole process further. And the first question I'm going to ask today of myself and then start to answer it is, why would you even put effort into thinking about hidden disabilities and conditions in the workplace? And I think there's one very clear answer, which is it is actually just simply the right thing to do. So I don't think you always need a business case for everything. Sometimes you just need to do things because it's the right thing to do. Okay, and I can't really highlight that enough. The second is that if you do get it right, it actually helps with both recruiting great people and then retaining others. And we've seen evidence of that in the university sector, where they took part in what became known as the Athena Swan Award, which started off in terms of looking at gender, but moved on to race and is now including disability. And what universities have shown is that they can literally improve the number of people who are applying, the quality of the people applying, and the people who stay, by talking openly about what they do to ensure gender, race, and disability equality in the workplace. And they have data. So back to the Star Wars point earlier that David was making, they have data that even Spock would be interested in looking at. So the final piece is, why would you bother? And I think part of it that I've found in life is that by having a diversity of different people in the workplace, you can often find solutions to problems far more easily. And I always remember at Wellcome Trust, we were stuck on a really big, difficult problem. And there was somebody who was just very, very quiet in the room for the whole of that meeting. And I was chairing it, and I just decided, because we were all getting stuck and deciding we were going to go for a lunch break to try and crack the problem, to invite this person who'd been quiet all the way through to speak. And I didn't really know her at that stage. Everybody went quiet. She spoke. She gave us a completely and utterly different insight. She spoke in a way that I'd never heard someone speak before, very bluntly, very directly, and quite loudly. It stopped the meeting in its tracks, because what she did was to say to us a number of things which we'd missed completely. We then had the lunch break. I talked to her. I learned that she was autistic. I learned that she was probably one of the most helpful people in that meeting to get us out of our problem. And from then on, invited her and others that I discovered that had autism within the organisation to become more and more involved in some of the projects. So it was this fantastic use of people of diversity, in this case neurodiversity, that helped. But I think we all have seen the articles and heard the understanding that if you have a lot of people the same, so all the same aged women in the room, they won't get to as good a decision as a mixture of men and women. They won't get to as good a decision as a mixture of people from different religious backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, and in my case, I'm saying also add neurodiversity into that as well. So how did I go about the book? I interviewed 75 people. I ended up with 65 different conditions that I listed. Many of them I'd never even heard of before. And I decided, as you've heard, to give this a chance to really take off, and for the volunteers to feel like they really wanted to be a part of it, to simply say any profit that was made from it would go to Macmillan, who happened to be one of the most amazing charities in terms of the quality of their website and the access that they provide to different workplace teams. So if you've got any issues at all, they often will have the answer. The next part you can see on the slide, for those of you who are looking at it, is some simple facts. In 20, and then they also stated that 1.1 million needed a wheelchair. So that leaves us with 13 million people who are disabled, and it's not that obvious. They're not in a wheelchair. Some will have very obvious hearing aids. Some will have walking sticks, or they'll be blind and have a sighting stick. But you can tell that there is a huge number of people with a hidden disability or condition. In fact, it's as simple as it says there. When you're walking along the street, 1 in 5 people have got exactly that, a hidden disability. So as you look at that bus stop and the 6 people in the bus stop, there's a really good chance at least one has a hidden disability. One of the people I interviewed made it clear why this is so important for us all to think about. She said that on the previous, about 3 days prior, she'd gone to Tesco's, she had parked in the disabled parking bay, got out and walked into the shop, and another woman came over, hurled abuse at her and spat at her and said, "Where the F is your wheelchair? You can't park in those bays, they're reserved for effing wheelchair people." This woman has a hidden condition that means she can walk about 1,000 steps, after which she has to stop and have a complete rest. 1,000 steps, if you're going shopping, is not a lot. And she likened it to a battery on a phone. She said, "I've got one shot each day in terms of one recharge of my battery. If I go too far, I will literally collapse and not be able to go further. I have to conserve my battery. I therefore need to park near the front door of Tesco's. I can't park 300 yards away from Tesco's and then I will lose all those steps." And it brought it home to me just how difficult that can be for people. So there's a thought just to make you think. When you see somebody who gets out the car and walks into Tesco's, they don't necessarily have to have a visible disability. And it's always made me think from now on not to always just assume that they're being sly and just using it cheekily. The final bit of this slide, and then we're going to any Q&A on the first things I've said, is around diagnosis. And the other thing that was very common with all of the 75 was that very few of them had been diagnosed at the first meeting with their GP for their disability. The story goes like this: you attend your GP, you tell them about the pain that you have. The GP says, prods, listens, but only has 5 minutes, and says, "I suggest that you take some paracetamol and come back in 2 weeks if it's still a problem." 2 weeks later, you go back, you say you've still got the problem. The doctor says, "Okay, let's get you some blood tests." 2 weeks later, you get the blood test results. They don't show anything. Further tests are maybe set up. Sometimes the blood tests show something, and then you're referred and you wait for a specialist to talk to you. But a lot of the issue is simply that the GP in their 5 minutes with you is trained and has to simply diagnose and resolve, sorry, not diagnose, they just have to resolve the presenting problem. So often, for example, some of the people I was talking to, they were doing things like being told, "Here's some antibiotics, try those for 2 weeks, then come back." And then that was all that the GP could offer or think about. Where I'm going with this is to say, if any of you start to have symptoms, keep a little diary, keep a list of what's happened. I've got a headache, I've got a sore throat, I've got a pain in my stomach, I've got a pain in my pelvis, my feet aren't working at the rate they are. Put the times of when that happens, keep the diary going. And then when you visit the GP, you can present the diary, they can read very quickly down through their screen, and they can read faster than they can ask you the questions. The GP therefore can get a lot of data by just looking at your diary and thinking, "Oh, right, these 4 things in combination could be something more significant, which I need to get referred straight to a specialist or have a specific piece of work done." The other thing that I picked up from people in terms of this diagnosis phase is a lot of times people are quite overawed by the GP. They forget that they can actually take a colleague or a friend with them, or an advocate, and that's worth just thinking about. Having somebody there who can ask the right questions or take notes on your behalf. And also, if you're just not happy with what's being suggested, there's nothing to stop you from asking for a second referral. Okay, so that's my first slides, and it's just to say, Tamsin, over to you. I think you're chairing any Q&A that you've seen coming through.
I am indeed. Thanks, Ted. if anybody's got any questions, do they want to submit it? But I was just reading David's comment he's just put in, because obviously there has been some background noise, unfortunately, during the first part of your presentation, Ted, and it was actually quite an interesting kind of, I suppose, a reflection by David. That actually this kind of, people who have sound sensitivity will find it very difficult to filter out the background noise and able to kind of listen to other people speaking. So actually, I think it's probably quite helpful for us, because I know that the noise is quite distracting and it takes a lot more effort to listen than probably is what's normally expected. If other people don't have a question, I have a bit of a question for you. So as a manager of a team, and when you're telling the facts then about, the fact that there's like 13 million people probably with hidden disabilities, how as a manager, because not everybody wants to talk about the hidden disabilities, how do you, a couple of things for me is, how do you kind of ensure your staff know that you have an environment where they can come and talk to you about maybe the challenges they face, but also how do you make sure when you've got a team meeting of so many different diverse people, how do you make sure that everybody's voice is heard and we get the best out of them?
On that second part, I'm still learning myself, and I think the most difficult thing is when you're thrown into a meeting or a room with people that you don't know and haven't had a chance to get to know. It's much easier if it's your own team and you've already spent time with them and you know some of the issues and the conditions that they are having to look after and face. So the way that I now do it, and I've only learned this really through all of this research for the book, is to ask for who's attending a meeting in advance, and then send them an email just saying, have you got any things that I need? And then I list down the kinds of things that they can ask me for. So some people are quite prepared to be open about the fact that they struggle to speak in a meeting, that they feel quite shy or timid and often overawed by others. Them having the confidence to tell me that means that I can then draw them in, or sometimes in a break just say, what were your thoughts on that? Because they're happy to talk one-on-one after the meeting. So that can work quite well. And it's finding these little ways of opening those things up. On the bigger question of how do you get to a point where you understand and know what it is that people have, or the conditions that they are living with, it is entirely up to them. There are quite a few of these people who I was interviewing who have, even though they're in HR, most of them were HR people, they've never told their employer that they have that condition, because they are still to this day worried that it will then create a stigma, reduce their opportunity for progression. And I think when I was at Wellcome Trust, we realised this was a major problem with issues around neurodiversity and particularly mental health. And we introduced mental health first aiders as the first step, and then as the second step we started getting significant senior people talking about their own issues. So the ice was really broken when one of our major executive directors stood on the stage and said, I suffer from and always have suffered from anxiety attacks. And for example, this morning, knowing that I was going to make this speech, I spent at least 20 minutes in the loo. It was a huge revelation, but his courage in terms of talking about it meant that suddenly lots of people wanted to talk about their own situation, and they felt that it was possible to do that and it wouldn't cause issues for them.
Yeah. Ted, that's really useful, and it's going to make me reflect on some of the stuff that we're doing internally to kind of, I think, create an environment or a culture that's more kind of open, more transparent, where, and getting people to kind of stand up and talk and be open about kind of what impacts them, I think is going to be important. So I think it's definitely something for us to take away. And whilst we were talking, and with this, I've got a couple more things that have come through. And is it Eva? I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that right, Eva, so apologies if I've got it wrong, but she's asked actually if we can use this session as part of our mandatory training for senior practitioners and managers. So we have got already some internal training, but I think we can definitely make sure this video is available to the wider population and promote it, Eva. I think it's really important. Questions come through from Jake Hartley. How do you get managers to understand that your disability impacts a lot more than is shown, and therefore you get burnt out very often, but you don't want to come across as someone who is whiny? As I feel every time I let my supervisors know that I'm having a bad day, that they don't actually get it, nor do they support it.
And that Jake, is blimmin' difficult. because until somebody has actually experienced this, or a member of their family has experienced it, I don't think they easily get it. And that's why I start to turn to analogies like the woman who talked to me about referring to herself as an iPhone battery. You know, that was a great moment for me, and it helped me understand what she meant. You know, so she was saying the impact on me over a day is that I have so much energy I can use up, and then I am literally exhausted. And she talked about that to not just her line manager, but to two of her colleagues as well, who would often be thinking, oh, she's a slacker. Why is she part of this team? But what she was able to do by opening up and talking about it with her colleagues, the colleagues then talked to the line manager and said, no, we've got her back, we'll look after her. And what I think they realised was that whereas in a standard day between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, she might look like she was having quite a few rest periods more than anybody else. The simple bit was that she often made up for it by being the one who just quietly got on with something at 8 o'clock that night because she was on an upper and she felt good, or she would do 2 hours on a Saturday morning, even though it wasn't in her contract, because she felt like she wanted to give something back and she was feeling fresh and good, and so she just went for it. And the best thing I think that's come out of the pandemic so far is the opportunity for lots of people to work flexibly from home. It means that they can work when it suits them, when they're on their best form, and they can give of their best. And that's just been brilliant, you know, without having to, some of these people using up part of their battery just to go through the stress of driving into work and then walking into their office. Instead, they're literally walking from their kitchen into their front room and they're starting work.
Thanks, Ted. There's quite a lot of comments, but I'm quite conscious of time. So
yeah.
Should we go to section 2, and then we can have, maybe if you have time at the end, we can look at some of the comments that come through, but it's all very positive.
Cool. So I thought an important thing would be just to talk a little bit about some of the examples. As I said, I think there's 65 things in here altogether. One that I was vaguely aware of, but I'd always, in my head, and this just shows I'm just as bad as any other old male, pale person lying around. I always thought of a lot of things as just being women's issues, and for heaven's sake, just pull yourself together and get on with it. Start interviewing people who become very open about what's happening to them, and you discover that there's a very difficult, different world, which as a male I'd never had a sight of. Fibroids is the first one, and what a fibroid is it's a small growth of fibrous or muscular tissue that develops in or around the womb. Nearly always happens after puberty, or is triggered at puberty. There's 4 different types. What they call intramural, which is when there's an extra layer of muscle that develops on the uterus. Subserosal, where the uterus starts to move into the pelvic cavity. Submucosal, where the inner lining of the uterus starts to develop at an alarming rate. And rendiculated, which is the attachment essentially to the uterus by little stalks. When this all starts, fibroids that is, they are very small, tiny little things. And they can be literally the size of a grain of rice, and then over time can develop into quite large bodies. And the things that people pick up on when they first get it are they don't even know they've got fibroids, but they start to realize they've got pain, sometimes sickness, often fatigued, and they have heavy and irregular periods. Those are the common things that you see. Another side effect can be constipation, the need to urinate far more frequently than usual, and because the hormones are all being affected, mood swings. For people who've got fibroids, particularly the very large ones, when they get picked up on an ultrasound, sometimes they have to have surgery, sometimes they have to have an embolism, sometimes they have to have a chemical intervention that's a bit like a mini chemotherapy to try and resolve the fibroids or to reduce the impact that they're having. But if you think about that, the fibroids impact the individual by coming in waves. Sometimes it's still linked to the normal menstrual cycle. But what it can mean, for example, for one of the women I was talking to, is that roughly when her normal menstrual cycle would start, she would get really extreme pelvic pain and literally have to curl up in bed, pull the covers over her and just ride it out for 24 hours. There was no pain relief that could help her. For another of the people I talked to who had fibroids, she said the menstrual cycle was so extreme that there was no commercial padding available that would stop the blood from leaking out. And she learned this with a very embarrassing first time when she suddenly had someone say to her, "I think you've got blood on your dress," and basically what had happened is it all leaked out. So we're talking about stuff that no one can see. This is a hidden disability in that nobody can look at that person and go, "Ha, she's got fibroids," in the same way that you can go, "Ha, that person's blind because they have a white stick and dark glasses." But it's very real for that person. So what do you do to try and help someone who has fibroids in the workplace? And essentially the first thing to do is to think it's actually different for everybody. So if someone says to you, "I have just been diagnosed with fibroids," it doesn't mean there is one answer that can help that individual. There's probably 4 or 5 different things depending on how they get it and the severity. So the lady who gets very heavy menstrual cycle, it might be that you want to give her the access key to the disabled toilet and move her office space so that she's nearer, so that when something starts to come on, she doesn't have the embarrassing long walk down a corridor to find the loo. For the person who needs to double up in pain, you need to have a real flexible understanding and just go, "I get it, you've just texted me, you're not in today. I am fine with that. And it's lovely that you've said you'll make up for it by working Saturday morning to clear your backlog. Love you for it," or whatever. So it's about thinking, how do you look after and provide that support? And if somebody gets fibroids to the point where they're really bad, then they might need surgery. Sometimes that surgery can bring on early menopause, and then that can bring on huge mood swings and issues for the individual. So how do you help them? And the most important thing, I think, is to show empathy, understanding, and the ability to just listen and talk it through. Because for that person, especially early onset menopause, it can have all sorts of other concerns and implications. Will I ever be able to have children? Because some of the women who get fibroids are in their early 20s. And as I said earlier, the very first ones start at puberty, so that can be in teenage years. So it's not something you can just sweep aside and say, this is a problem that older women have. It can affect anybody. Okay, so that's an example. And it shows you something, as I say, that I wasn't even aware of really until I started talking to people and learning about it. Another one that I've highlighted here is lupus. I've highlighted lupus because this is a disease where essentially the immune system turns on itself, and instead of attacking bacteria or viruses, your own body starts to attack your own joints, your lungs, your heart, your kidneys, your brain, your skin, and you get all sorts of horrible flare-ups when it's choosing to attack, because the autoimmune immune system just literally malfunctions. The reason I've highlighted it is one of the people, it took 12 years to be diagnosed. 12 years before diagnosis. Up till that point, she was getting steroids to resolve her skin rashes. She was getting all sorts of drugs to reduce her pain. Of course, when you start going on to steroids, you then get additional drugs, other things. Everything's blamed on the steroids as a side effect. So she went through a huge period. And the biggest difficulty, I think, with lupus is that at this moment in time, there still isn't one single blood test that can resolve it or explain it. And nobody quite knows how it starts. It's believed that it's probably trauma. Now, that trauma can be an infection. The trauma can literally be like PTSD, which I'll talk about in a minute, a huge event that sparks something in the body. But it can be treated to an extent with steroids, with chemotherapy, believe it or not, and with antimalarials, a really horrible cocktail. When that's all going through, the individual that's working with you will need quite significant amounts of time off and support. But it is essential that you provide that, because the other thing that's impacted is their mental health. Because as they're going through this, they're worrying. You know, if a doctor says to you, you need chemotherapy to reset your immune system, and you mustn't come into contact with anybody who's got a virus or a cold, it will worry you, particularly if you're a younger person. And again, one of the people I was talking to was mid-20s. The accommodations that you need in the office are very different depending on exactly which type of lupus the individual's got. But it's, again, comes back to flexible working. And I think, Tamsin, you know, for the HR team at Wiltshire, this is the single biggest issue, which is how can you provide support which allows people to be ultimately very flexible, to be able to switch day for night sometimes, a day for a weekend, because all of these people said, the thing is, I want to work, I want to prove that I can play my part. It's just that when that flare-up happens on a Tuesday, I am good for nothing. So I don't want to be written off, and worse, I don't want the automated absence recording system to flag me up for yet another visit to occupational health, when all they can do is go, oh yeah, you're the one with lupus, aren't you? You didn't really need to come. I'll try and get the machine to turn off the automatic intervention. One of the things you can do with people with lupus is to make an adjustment for them. For example, one of the people, she takes about 2 hours to get herself sorted from waking up in the morning. So she's much better at starting at 11 and then working through till about 8 at night. That's her pattern that works for her. She needs regular breaks, so more regular than everybody else. But also she can't do things like sit in sunlight for too long. She really can't be around when people have got colds and viruses. So she actually needs her own office, which is well ventilated, and that's just about to be provided for her, and it's in an open plan office area. So they've actually made an extraordinary effort to provide her with a working environment that's good. It leads to other people saying, how come she's got an office? It therefore leads to sometimes having to be open with colleagues about the fact that there is a really good reason. Does that sort of make sense? I hope it makes sense. And the final one that I'm just going to relate to here, and then we'll go to Q&A again, is PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder. I always thought PTSD was something related to troops coming back from Afghanistan or another war, where a big explosion had occurred and they were traumatized by it. I think it first became known in the First World War from the trench troops coming back. But of course, PTSD, as I've learned, and most of you probably already knew, can come about from many different reasons. I spoke to a chap who had witnessed a suicide. That was a huge trauma for him, and he still now feels guilty about, could I have done something to stop it? No amount of counselling is ever going to remove that for him. Time dulls it slightly, but it's a huge thing. Other people get PTSD following a crash or an accident, the death of a loved one, the death of a pet can lead to PTSD, and it is related sometimes to the sensitivity of the individual. Some people are hypersensitive individuals compared to others. The other things that can lead to PTSD are some very simple things. Puberty, for example, is now listed in some of the American journals as a cause of PTSD for young women. The other thing is cancer, often because it comes with chemotherapy or it comes with radiotherapy, and that can set off PTSD. There are medicines and support that can help. There's cognitive behavioural therapy, there's counselling. Some people, though, in terms of accommodations, if they've had an experience that is related to their current work situation, actually have, one person I talked to actually asked and requested to move departments because they couldn't comfortably work in that same department ever again after their supervisor wasn't killed at work, died at work from a heart attack, and they just couldn't face going into that area ever again. And rather than leave the company and go to someone else, somewhere else, they were given a reasonable time to adjust to work in a different group, which I thought was phenomenal. So there are some examples. The book contains 65 different things, and what's happening at the moment is that I'm getting people reading it and saying to me, oh, you didn't include such and such a condition. So the second edition is already starting to be researched, and what will happen is that in 2023 there'll probably be as many as 80 conditions that are covered in the book once I've had all this next series of conversations with people. Okay, Tamsin, back over. You've been monitoring chat, or if not, I know you're good at coming up with questions yourself, so I'll hand over to you again.
Well, I'm just going to reflect back because I have to say this is really quite eye-opening for me, because you do think about hidden disabilities and you think about kind of some of the kind of common names, but the ones actually you put down here are things that you're aware of, but you don't think of them necessarily as hidden disabilities, but have a huge impact on people and people's lives and how they work. And I think you've talked about kind of the need for flexibility within organisations and policies to support people to work when they're fit to. And I know Sarah's also put in the chat about actually her manager being supportive and understanding those days when she's more fit to work than others. And I think we are starting a journey as an organisation to new ways of working that I hope will better support people to work when they can work. But it is definitely something we need to continue on. So let me kind of read you some of the questions that came through. So we've got Christine Brown. She actually wrote this at the end of the last one, but came in just slightly late. So we've kind of already started talking again. But she asked, how much difference does language make? She was really glad that the title is Hidden Disabilities and Conditions. So without being accused of political correctness, can we reflect our positivity about things like neurodiversity in our language? So her daughter lives with autism. She does not suffer from it. She suffers from other people's preconceptions.
And I still fall into that. So I know that every so often I will say something like, this person suffers from that. And I haven't managed to get that out of my system yet. So I'm struggling with it. I think I'm probably more aware than I ever was before of the use of language in all sorts of aspects. So, for example, I spoke to one person who was originally diagnosed as Asperger's, but has fought never to get that mentioned again because of the link between Asperger and the Nazi prison camps and the research that Asperger did. And so there are all sorts of things in our language which in the same way that we have to be thoughtful around gender and race, we have to be even more so, I think, in terms of ability, disability and conditions. There are a group of people that I had a forum with who don't like the fact that I've called this hidden disabilities. They don't like the word disability at all and would prefer it wasn't even in the language. My rationale for using it is simply to highlight it because it is commonly used and is used in law still at the moment. And that if people are going to find the book, it probably has to be that. If I'd got hidden conditions as the title, it would be less easy for people to stumble across it or find it. But no, I put my hands up. I think it's very, very difficult indeed. And different people with the same condition refer to it in different ways. So I have one person that I'm talking to who says she works at the Wellcome Collection and she's very proud of the fact that she's autistic, and she says, I'm autistic to people at the start of the talk she gives. And there's a colleague that she works with who never mentions it, doesn't want anyone to reference it, and is trying to lead her life without reference to it.
And that reflects the individuality of us all, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Sarah has put some comment and a question. So when society has a long way to go, how do we get more people to see value in our disability related differences? She always feels like she's preaching all on her soapbox.
Yeah, and my experience so far is that the more we can talk about this and the more that we can highlight some of the good things that come, the better. So, for example, around neurodiversity, I've started raising this whenever I talk to an executive team, is to say, to actually challenge them and to say, it's great that you've all got an Oxbridge education and that you've all come through a very similar pattern in life and that you all played rugby for the first 15. But what you lack in this group is diversity of thought or diversity of opinion or diversity of the way in which you see the world, or therefore you can see the challenges in the world. And I've encouraged them to introduce people to their team meetings. So that is to say, to think about bringing people on as a shadow executive to get their ideas and thoughts, to have a staff representative or colleague turning up for at least part of the meeting that has a divergent view to theirs or a different way of looking at the world, to give them that opportunity to see things through different glasses. But the biggest single thing that I think worked for me at the Wellcome Trust was a series of every week different people stood up at a lunchtime seminar talking about their mental health issue and how they resolved and worked with it, and how people could make their lives feel more included within the business. It was the bravery of those people to start with, but secondly, getting an insight and understanding for everybody as to what it might be like to live as that person was phenomenal.
Okay, thank you. I'm quite conscious of time. I know we've got section 3 to go, so let's move on to section 3 and then we can go back because there's some really interesting comments coming through on the chat.
Yep. So I think that the very first thing to say is, if we're trying to create an inclusive environment in our workplace, the two things at the top there are the most important. Firstly is, when someone says something or mentions something, it's to listen properly. I dislike the fact that many people try and brush something over, or they're embarrassed about it as a line manager to hear it and just want to move on quickly to the next subject. If someone says to you, I have a disability or a hidden disability or a condition, the important thing is to take actual time out from the diary, to go to one side, to have a private space, and to find out exactly what it is and how you can be most helpful and support them. And then show them that you are understanding of their needs by making changes, even if they're small ones. Little things sometimes can be getting the IT team involved, bringing in some additional software. It can be providing notes for a meeting before the meeting for the person who takes a little bit of extra time to read through things, or to be able to think through things. It's like I said earlier, it's having a chat to the person who's a very quiet, shy reflector in the break to see if they've got an insight you would otherwise miss. It's all of those things that you need to do in terms of listening and understanding. The next little set of words all relates to the fact that if you're trying to create an inclusive environment, I think it starts from the first advert. When you put an advert out and you're looking for somebody to join your council, have you checked that the words aren't overly aggressive or macho? There are totaljobs.com, for example, has a checker. You put all the words and the language in, and it tells you just how macho or selective it is for a particular kind or type of person, and that can be a really helpful start. But if you are part of something like the Disability Confidence Scheme or the Stonewall Diversity Champions, putting that in an advert actually says to a whole additional section of society, these people take this seriously, and I might well be at home and comfortable there. For example, I said I had one person who was looking for a new role after being made redundant, genuine redundancy as a consequence of the pandemic. She has ADHD, and also, so this is not great, she has ADHD and she is partially sighted. And she said, seeing somebody saying that they supported and worked with Stonewall made her feel confident to want to apply. Not because, classic thinking here, Stonewall is about LGBTI. But instead, because you said if they've got that thinking around LGBTI, they've probably got that thinking or the ability to think about my condition. So that's how powerful that was. Worth thinking about. Obvious other thing to say is, where do you run your adverts? How accessible do you make them? I think some people sometimes forget that not everybody is searching incessantly on the internet, and that there are, if you really want to open up the opportunities, it's to go to specific groups and say, we've got an opportunity here, it might be suitable for somebody with the condition that you have. As opposed to doing it the other way around, which is always to find excuses to say why a job isn't available. For interviews, one of the nicest things you can do is to check in with the candidate in advance of the interview being set, and just asking them, are there any things that we should be aware of where we can help make sure that your interview experience is as good as can be. So for example, for some people, the time of the day might be really important to them, and they might actually need to be seeing you for the interview late morning or early afternoon. They might need to have a particular seating position or a hearing loop. They might need to have extra time if you're doing an administrative task or a profiling or personality profile. Many people struggle with simple things like stairs. So I've now adopted the habit of, if I'm taking a candidate around a building, I don't say to them, are you okay with the stairs? I take them straight to the lift. So I don't even ask the question anymore. I just use the lift. Because the interview is not testing their ability to climb stairs or wiping them out so that they're exhausted by the time they get into the interview room. It's about being supportive and helpful and making sure that when they get to the interview room, they're in the best possible condition. A lot of people with hidden disabilities and conditions, and particularly those with around neurodiversity, sometimes need a reset in the middle of an interview. So if an interview is going wrong, it is not fair or reasonable to crash on with it and ask the next question. Sometimes it's best, whoever's chairing that or the HR representative that's involved in the interview, to just call time out, go for a short walk around the block, stop for a loo break, have a glass of water, and allow the individual to restart. Just that simple moment means you get the best out of them and give them the best opportunity to be at their best in the place. I mentioned, induction is the next one. Induction, when you have somebody with a declared disability or condition, probably involves, and I think at the moment it falls usually on human resources, but it can be the line manager. It depends on how you wish to structure it. Somebody to talk to facilities about making sure that the appropriate adjustments are made. Somebody talking to IT about specific requests that are needed in terms of either hardware, like specific mice or lighting, or software that's required. But also sometimes it's about talking to catering or thinking about what happens in the case of a fire. How does this individual leave the building? There are some people who have an allergic reaction, is the nicest way of putting it, to an alarm going off. You need to know who those people are, and you need to have somebody who's always assigned to go with them, support them, and help them out of the building when the alarm goes off. They could well be in a situation of being quite panicked by the alarm going off. So it's about how do you support all those things and not just concentrate on the need for the individual to meet everybody in the organisation urgently. The next bit on here is absence monitoring. I did mention it earlier, and it is to say that absence monitoring can be fine in terms of spotting someone who is deliberately always drinking and eating too much on a Sunday night and not making it in on a Monday morning. But you have to remember it could always be for another reason. And those people who have declared that they have a disability or a condition, you really don't want to be in a situation where you're always calling them up. Flexible working we also mentioned, so I can move through these bits now quite quickly. Flexible working is the single largest thing that all of the 75 people I interviewed said was essential for them. When we talked about facility support, the final bit then is benefits programs, employee advisory resource, EAR phone numbers, etc. There are often things that are hidden or not known about, where confidential support and counselling can be provided at very low cost. A lot of people who are diagnosed, if they're diagnosed whilst they're working for you with a disability or a condition, will often have a mental health issue that comes alongside it. Often the NHS can't afford or pay for people to have counselling and support, but the EAR programme that you get through your standard benefits could well be providing that. Or if you haven't got an EAR programme, it's a relatively cheap thing to provide and provides brilliant stuff. Okay, so back to Tamsin and further Q&A.
Okay, okay, thank you very much, Ted, for that. While I wait for questions to come in, I was just going to kind of update you on the chat. So there's been a lot of discussion actually with the participants here around kind of language and how they prefer to be referred to. So in terms of kind of whether it's disability or not disability, and there's some sharing of what other countries do, and there very much is a real individual view on the different terms used. You know, but sometimes the conversation, sometimes some of the terms can feel quite patronising, as though they're kind of superhumans or superheroes. But what it doesn't do is reflect actually the daily struggles that many people have in their lives. And I think really kind of coming through very clearly is that real need for awareness and understanding by I suppose the rest of the world really, and people around, to make sure they kind of do support and understand the difficulties and challenges others have.
Yeah, I think I think the biggest single difficulty that I still pick up is just a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding. There are an awful lot of people who've gone through without any problems. When I had quite a lot of people talk to me about their experiences with menopause, for example, and one of the women who'd had particularly bad mood swings and issues and difficulties, which had even led to a divorce. She said to me the worst thing of all was that her manager had no time for her. Her manager was a woman, and her manager, as a woman, just simply said, "I've been through the menopause, I got through it, you can all get through it, just pull your socks up and get on with it. Don't be so stupid, this is pathetic." And therein lies the biggest single problem. How on earth do you educate and help people understand that everybody has to go through these conditions and issues in different ways, and they struggle in different ways, and a lot of that struggle is often hidden because the face that they put on or the makeup they put on hides lots of horrible things in the background.
And until we start to talk about it openly, I think that kind of continues to perpetuate itself. I've got two questions for you, Ted, and then I know we're kind of close to the end, but firstly, I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly now. It's Eva, I think. She's asking what is an EAR program?
So this is a program that's provided by some organisations, and I'm going to look to Jan to help. If do you know, Jan, if this is provided or something similar to this is provided at Wiltshire?
So you're referring to like an employee assistance?
EAR, yeah.
And we have an in-house occupational health provision that would support people with that. For most people at Wiltshire, it would be via Rock Health. Okay,
so if I have just had a really grim experience and the NHS can't provide me with counselling and support, would I be able to get that through Rock Health at Wiltshire?
You could approach either your line manager or Rock Health directly, and they would sort of work with you to identify what support was available, which might include counselling.
Brilliant. And what you've just said there is really encouraging, because some companies insist that everyone has to go through their line manager, but they're saying the last thing I want to do is talk to my line manager. So you're saying it's possible for them to go direct to Oc Health, which is phenomenal. Really good practice, best practice.
It's good to hear. Okay, so I've got a question actually for Jan, for you, Ted. So hi, Ted. From your research, what is the biggest human factor that makes a difference for people aside from flexible working?
I think it is education and listening. I know that I've already mentioned that before, but the simple thing is there are lots of people who are willing to find out and learn. They just have to be shown this opportunity or shown what's possible. So if I'm hoping that one or two of you who've listened today and put up with the road sweeper outside. It's not a road sweeper, by the way, it's a huge, great suction machine that's trying to pick up all the leaves. And in front of where I live, there's a big triangle which collects all the leaves, and it's just chosen the worst possible moment ever to decide to do it. But they're working hard, and we need it done because it's a dangerous trip hazard at the moment. So back to the answer, it is to say, it's how on earth do you get this message out? As soon as you open it up, people start going, oh wow. Often when you talk to people about this, they start going, oh yeah, actually thinking about it, my mum had that or had this difficulty. So it's how do you personalize it so that they start to feel it viscerally and understand what it is that you're talking about, and giving them that insight. The other thing I'll say is I never really understood what it was like being pregnant, and I guess I never can and never will. But I do remember being given a very heavy prosthetic false large stomach to strap on, and I had to wear it for the day. After that, I never ever complained about a woman who was pregnant talking about backache or the inability to pick things up, bend down, go to the loo or anything else. It was horrendous. And if there's any male on here thinking that pregnancy is easy, just wear that for a day, and then think about the woman who has to wear it for at least 5 months.
Thanks, Ted. We don't have any more time for questions stuff, but I just want to say thank you for myself and on behalf of everyone else attending today. I mean, I hope they all found it useful. I know I have. One, as a manager, I think this has been hugely beneficial, and just to understand the scale of it and to understand, I think, how everybody's situation is individual. And we really are, I do believe in taking individual approaches, but I think I need to think a bit more reflectively around actually what are some of the struggles that are, happening within my team. It's also been really useful for me, and I think Wally will hopefully agree, and Jan as well, about actually the policies and processes we have within the council. And I think this is going to give us an opportunity to reflect back on some changes and improvements that we can potentially make to kind of support our staff. So a huge thank you for me. To everyone attending, thank you very much for attending. We do obviously have the Carers and Disability Staff Network, so if you haven't joined, I have seen some of the comments today. So please do feel free to join it, whether you have a disability or not. It's quite important to support each other, and we also have a lot of resources available on our learning and development and Epic Hub around what support is currently available within the council. Ted has kindly offered to stay on for another half an hour to take any direct questions that you have. So if you do have any questions, please do stay behind and take advantage of that. But thank you very much, Ted. That's been brilliant.
Thanks for chairing, Tamsin.
So just see if anybody's got any questions that's staying on. I think you've got some thank yous coming up.
I'll stay on for a while. Thank you again, Ted.
David.